Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on strategic planning, building a plan that yields results. I'm Susan McGuire, Director of Professional Development at ACCE. Today's webinar will be led by ACCE President and CEO Sheree Kelly, David Brown, President and CEO of the Greater Omaha Chamber, and Kate Bates, President and CEO of the Arlington, Virginia Chamber. In today's webinar, we will learn how ACCE developed its current strategic plan, as well as how two of your peers set their own chamber's directions and priorities using two very different models and processes. At the end of the presentation, our panelists will be happy to take your questions. Contact information for our panelists is also provided on the last slide in case you would like to contact them directly. The webinar will be recorded and will be posted on ACCE's webinar page along with the presentation slides. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists for today. As President and CEO of ACCE, Sheree Kelly is responsible for leading our ACCE team, which serves the chamber community through professional development, innovative problem solving, best practices, and industry thought leadership. Previously, Sheree was Senior Vice President of the Public Affairs Council and Executive Director of their foundation. During her 16 years at this global association, she served as Chief Public Affairs Expert and oversaw thought leadership, consulting, and benchmarking services. Sheree prior roles included positions in the Government Affairs Department of the National Association of Home Builders, and she also served on the Corporate Development and Corporate Relations teams at the U.S. Chamber. Sheree holds an MBA from Georgetown, a Master of Arts in Government from Johns Hopkins, and a Bachelor of Arts from Bucknell University. Her current industry leadership roles include serving on the Executive Committee of the World Chambers Federation and also a member of the U.S. Commerce Chamber Committee of 100. Kate Bates serves as President and CEO of the Arlington Chamber of Commerce. She began her tenure with the Chamber in 2007. And she served in areas of increasing responsibility and was appointed to the CEO role in June of 2014. Under her leadership, the Chamber has increased their business advocacy efforts with notable state and local successes, as well as growing significantly in membership. Prior to joining the Chamber, Kate worked for Women in Government, a national nonpartisan association of women state legislatures. Kate's a graduate of the George Washington University with a BA in Political Science and International Affairs. She has her IOM from the Institute of Organization Management, and she was recognized by ACCE this July as a 40 under 40 honoree. And finally, David Brown is President and CEO of the Greater Omaha Chamber, a 5-star accredited chamber and a 2015 ACCE Chamber of the Year winner. Along with chamber staff and volunteers, David works on behalf of more than 3,000 member businesses, encouraging their success by advocating for a strong business climate, creating opportunities for member visibility and business connections, pursuing investment and jobs for the region, strengthening leaders in the community, and enhancing the region's brand and image. David began his career in organizational leadership in Michigan in 1983 as president of the Monroe County Industrial Development Corporation and director of the Port of Monroe. He also served at the Greater Fort Wayne Chamber of Commerce, the Greater Greenville Chamber of Commerce, and the Greater Greenville Chamber of Commerce before beginning as CEO of the Omaha Chamber in 2003. A graduate of Dartmouth College, David currently serves as the chair of ACCE's Board of Directors and is a member of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Committee of 100. So at this point, Sheree, I will pass the presentation over to you.
Thank you, Susan, and good morning, everybody. This is a topic I really enjoy. We recently went through this exercise at ACCE, so I'll talk a fair amount about what we did here in our association, but it's also a topic that I talk to a lot of our members about, what kind of strategic planning initiatives you can put in place to be the most effective that you can be in your own work. I will lead by saying there is absolutely no silver bullet. We are happy to share sample strategic plans from other chambers, but what's most important is to make sure you're aligning your work to the most critical needs in your own community. Doesn't mean you can't learn from other organizations, but I oftentimes have folks ask me, what's the perfect and ideal strategic plan? There really isn't one. But what I happen to think is most important in the planning process are the situational assessments that you do in advance. So I'm going to walk you through what we did here at ACCE, just to showcase how much data and outreach we did before even putting pen to paper to figure out where we wanted to go as an organization. So one of the first things I did when I came on board as a new CEO 2 years ago was an in-depth CEO listening tour. So I went out into the field and met with some of our chamber leaders, spoke by phone with a host of other executives just to ask what's working, what's not, what are their impressions of the organization. And this gave me great feedback. It was a chance for me to connect with people from many different sized organizations, many geographies, and start to see some trends and patterns in the engagement that we had between our members and ourselves. That was sort of the first tool that I leveraged. Then I wanted to get a bigger, broader perspective from both members and non-members. So we conducted a wide-sweeping member satisfaction survey, which was something we really hadn't embarked on, at least not in recent years, in a strategic and broad sense. So we asked lots of questions about what are the areas that you would like to see more resources or services in? Where are you satisfied? Where are you not satisfied? And we also asked the question around a net promoter score. This is something we had not engaged in previously as an organization. And the net promoter score, while not an ideal and perfect metric, it's an interesting one because it gives you a clear sense of whether your members would recommend you to their peers or not. So we decided to get a baseline assessment of how our members felt about our organization through that net promoter score. We also sent out a non-member survey because we realized it's just as important to find out why individuals or organizations aren't engaging with you as much as they are. So we surveyed our non-members and actually got a relatively large percentage of individuals who completed the survey. We weren't sure what kind of response we'd get, and we were surprised by that. So we had some nice data sets to work with. I'm a big fan of benchmarking. So we did some national benchmarking and trend assessment. We used the American Society of Association Executives. They have some great benchmarking data to try to figure out how do we rank compared with other national associations. And then we did an internal sort of audit of a lot of our operations. Where did we think our budget trends were going? We did a legal assessment of all of 3 of our entities here at ACCE. We did an IT audit just to get a sense of what are our internal processes, where are the gaps and vulnerabilities there. We did a revenue trends analysis, and this was an interesting exercise where we looked at all of our revenue and expense lines and tried to figure out 5 or 10 years down the road, where do we think those numbers are going to shift? Do we see opportunities in certain areas? Are others maybe going to phase out? And this helped inform a lot of our decision-making on where we wanted to go moving forward. We also interviewed some millennial chamber professionals. We knew that this was a market that was going to continue to move up in the leadership ranks of our organization, and we wanted to make sure we were addressing their needs, challenges, and opportunities. So that was more of a qualitative feedback component, but it was incredibly helpful to figure out how we were, and more importantly, how we weren't serving some of our younger and up-and-coming members. We had meetings with non-engagers, so individuals and organizations that had never before been involved with ACCE to find out why. We hosted a great board retreat and really took advantage of some of the strong examples and strong leadership that we have on our board, got them engaged in the process, and then also had a staff retreat. So between the board and the staff retreat, some of the areas that we wanted to try to focus on and places that I usually recommend chambers focusing on, doing some sort of a SWOT analysis, whether it's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, or a similar assessment. But with the staff retreat, one of the hardest things to do is to ask the team, what can we stop doing? What are the areas that we're spending time and energy or money on that aren't serving our biggest purpose? You want to make sure that all of your resources are aligning to the mission of your organization. So if you've got one-off activities or you're serving a really small constituency with an event, you want to rethink that. You may make 6 or 8 members really happy with a program, but all of the work and effort and time that goes into it is not necessarily aligned with your big picture mission. For a staff retreat, we also try to think about what's our big, hairy, audacious goal. I know a lot of groups do this. I'm a big fan of dreaming big and having your staff and or your board dream big with you and think about what are some of the biggest goals you could set for yourself, even if they seem impossible to achieve right now, for 5, 10, or 15 years down the road. So these were some of the situational assessments that we went through in order to give ourselves some perspective before we built the plan. So this is essentially ACCE's strategic plan boiled down into its smallest visual component. I'm a big fan of simplifying your strategic plan initiatives for external audiences. So that's what we did here. We actually have our entire plan on our website. You can feel free to view it and see all of the details and tactics that we've outlined. But this gives you a general sense of what we came up with. So we have 4 pillars of focus for our activities. And then we have 2 lenses that cut across everything we do. So all of our goals, objectives, and tactics fit into one of these 6 categories. So the first vertical pillar is Center of Excellence. This is where we want ACCE to not only share best practices, but to stay 1 or 2 steps ahead of the curve so that we're talking about trends coming down the pike so we can better prepare all of you for some of the shifts that are taking place in your geographies. The second pillar is around chamber stories, and we want to make sure we're helping to equip chambers with storytelling techniques and tactics and best practices, but also so that ACCE can help serve as a national platform and a megaphone for chamber success stories. The third pillar is community advocacy, making sure we've got the right resources and services for some of those big issues that are shaping the future of our communities, whether it's workforce and talent, healthy communities, inclusive economic development, but also government affairs. How can we deliver the right products and services to advance communities? The last column is internal excellence. This is really a nod to our team here to make sure that we are designed and structured and operating in the most effective and efficient way that we can. And then our 2 lenses are diversity, equity, and inclusion, power in numbers, and connectivity. We want to make sure that these concepts cut across everything that we do in our organization. So this is the simplified version. Again, I love having something very clean and easy to understand when you're sharing that with an external audience. All right, so the next slide, metrics. We know measurements really matter, and they can serve lots of different purposes, whether it's return on investment or showcasing your community impact, tracking progress over time. I'm a big fan of both quantitative and qualitative measures. Ideally, when you can measure outcomes, that's your best possible scenario. And what I mean by outcomes is, are you moving the dial on perception, or are you changing the way people feel or think about your specific issue or topic? It's easy to measure inputs and outputs. Those are things like how many readers you get for a newsletter or how many emails you send out. Those are great to measure, easy to measure, and we all do measure those, but those are sort of busyness measures. I'm a big fan of trying to think a little bit more about whether or not you're changing and impacting the world around you. So these are ACCE's plan metrics. We did not have a strong system for data analytics, so we're putting that into place. My most important metric is member engagement, so we're going to be trying to find ways to measure that through a new database and some other methods that we put into place. We're going to host another membership satisfaction survey at the end of this 3-year strategic plan term, and we want to make sure that our net promoter score has gone up. We're looking to find creative and interesting partnerships that serve our goals and our mission. We're revamping our website, and we want to make sure we have more chamber executives and community partners visiting that site, more engagement across the board, trying to grow our social media outreach and increase our influencer engagement. We're also looking to increase our percentage of non-dues revenue and growing our overall revenue as well, since we know that membership revenue is flattening across a lot of nonprofits and chambers of commerce. And we also set a goal to increase our reserve funding. So those were our metrics. I didn't put in a slide about implementation, but obviously implementation is critical and how you put your plan together and make sure it comes to fruition. Accountability is king with that. Don't always assume that everyone in or outside your organization knows what your priorities are. So you sometimes have to repeat that. You can't over-communicate when it comes to priorities. And you also just want to make sure you're nimble on your execution and that you share your successes with both your staff internally, but also your external stakeholders. Let them know when you have a win, because it's easy to forget to celebrate those successes and sort of move on to the next challenge. So that's a very quick, high-level overview of ACCE strategic planning work. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Kate, who can share some of her insights from Arlington.
Good morning, everyone. So as Sheree Ann said, strategic plans are not a one-size-fits-all template. So it's very important that you start by assessing your current status and figure out, does your board have clarity on the chamber's direction? Is this intended to be a transformation or really a refinement of course? And that is very important to do before you dive into the strategic planning process. I'd really like to emphasize the importance of facilitator selection. We've gone through several strategic plans with our chamber, and we were really ready this time around for the next iteration and taking us to the next level. We have the fundamentals soundly in place, and we're really looking to grow as an organization. So for us, we actually selected Sheree Ann to be our facilitator, and we're really able to utilize all of the data that ACCE has in terms of benchmarking to see not just what's going on with other organizations in our community, but really other chambers across the country. And whether or not you're working directly with Sheree Ann on your strategic plan, you can really lean on all the resources of ACCE to be objective and see really where your organization is as a starting point. So two areas I'm going to dive in on are program review and execution. So program review, in the chamber field, we have so many wonderful new ideas that come from our staff members, as well as our board members and other volunteers. We see community needs, we identify them, we want to address them, and we're constantly adding to our bucket. But as Sheree Ann alluded to, it can be very challenging to figure out what to stop doing and where to refocus efforts. You often have a key group of stakeholders who care a lot about one event, but you have to look really big picture to figure out what's best for the organization. We know we all run very lean organizations with staff members doing so many things, and we have to be conscious about consistently adding new events and programs without taking anything off anyone's plate. So we developed a pretty extensive program review process with a matrix, and the ideas that we floated through were these were all of our current events and programs. We evaluated them in the areas that you'll see on your slide. So first and foremost, connection to mission. Our mission is to strengthen businesses and the economic environment for those who live, work, and do business in Arlington. You have your own mission, but it probably has a similar focus as a chamber. Figuring out how connected to the mission is this event. And again, we can probably draw the networking tie to basically any event or program we have, but what is it doing beyond networking? So for an example, one of the newer events we've developed with our chamber is a county board candidate forum, and that is not our largest revenue generator by any standards. But for us, that's extremely connected to our mission, where we've established that any candidate running for our county board comes through and they speak about the business issues. So we are not only giving our members the opportunity to hear from the candidates on where they stand, but we are establishing to anyone who's going to be moving into that office that the business community is a valued partner and a valued stakeholder. So that would be an example of an event that would be extremely connected to our mission. Net revenue. That is very self-explanatory. Obviously, we have to pay our bills as well, and the revenue impact of each of the events is very important. Staff effort. So different organizations do their budgets differently in terms of allocating their staff time, but figuring out, is this an event that your team has on autopilot, or does this involve a very heavy staff lift? And then trends. Is interest, and by interest we often mean attendance as well, increasing, decreasing, or staying flat? We pulled information for the last 3 to 5 years for all of these events so we could see really clearly, was attendance and interest going up, was it going down, or was it leveling out? Non-monetary value. So similar to the connection of mission, but this was an opportunity for some more qualitative feedback as well. And then finally, the audience or segment of our membership served through this program. So we had an entire task force work through all of our events and programs looking at these different aspects. And that audience and segment of membership served piece was very important to us. So for this task force, we actually brought in 2 non-board members in addition to board members because we wanted to be reflective of the membership in general. We have a Breakfast Connection series, which is beloved by a lot of our small business owners and really folks in the business development piece of their careers, people who are selling either business to consumer or business to business as well. This is not a C-suite event. This is really, a program valued by those in business development. The majority of our board members would see no value in the program, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have value to the organization in general. So this was a great opportunity to bring in some people who did see value and figure out, okay, if this is an event that's declining, what can we do to re-energize this, and how are we looking at all different aspects of our membership? We have something unique in our chamber, a hospitality awards, that rather than doing a hotel of the year or restaurant of the year, it actually honors front of the house and back of the house employees who are non-managers who often don't get that same recognition that they deserve so much. The hospitality sector is huge for Arlington and for our community, and really a huge piece of our chamber membership as well. So that's an example of an event that's the very specific segment, but a very large segment of our membership. So we worked through all of these different areas, and then we're able to really be objective and look at what events are serving us well and what events are not serving us well. And that was really our opportunity for transformation. So we saw a number of changes result as part of this. We eliminated some events, and then we transformed some events as well. Next slide, please, Susan. One example of an event we completely transformed was our golf tournament. This was really a legacy event that many chambers have a golf tournament because they've always had a golf tournament. So we saw those numbers were declining. We were having about 40 people at the event, but we had a core contingency who loved this event, and at the end of the day, it did result in an amount of revenue coming to the chamber. So we thought about this and said, what can we do to modernize this to really serve that mission? If it's really focused on the networking and connections, when we have our traditional 18-hole golf tournament, you talk with your foursome, you talk with, most directly the person in the cart with you, and then by the time we have the networking reception and dinner at the end and the awards, everyone's exhausted, they're sitting with their groups, they have a drink, they eat something, and then they go home. So we said, how can we do something that's a little more modernized here? So in our community, we have a Top Golf, and I know they're across the country and have similar competitor organizations as well, but this is essentially a driving range with targets, but it's accessible for all people, whether you've swung a golf club or not, whether you're a golf pro who's out on the links every weekend or someone who's, again, never swung a golf club at all. So this also appeals to a younger demographic as well. So we transformed our traditional 18-hole golf tournament into a Top Golf event that we called Cards and Clubs. The idea of the cards for the business cards and the clubs for the golf clubs. So this was extremely successful. Year one of the transformation, we had over 100 attendees when we had 40 at our previous event, and that's really continued to rise over the years. We developed great energy at the event. It's accessible for all people. We were actually able to retain those folks who were really focused on the golf aspect, but expand this to a wider audience that could be a team building event for our members, as well as a networking event. So that's just one example of how you can sort of take a traditional event, turn it on its head, take a little bit of a risk, and see what happens. For this event, we actually budgeted the first year, was really a guess of a budget, but we budgeted for flat revenue, but with the idea that we would increase attendance. And we actually saw an increase in revenue on top of that, as well as the increase in attendance and really in satisfaction of the members who attended as well. Next slide. So execution, Sheree had mentioned this as well, but we go through these amazing strategic planning processes. Our board is energized, our team is energized, and then what's next? So it really is two-part execution. It's the internal as well as the external. So for this iteration of our strategic plan, something that was really important to me was something our entire membership could get behind. We had strategic plans before that were great plans, but they were large Excel documents with lots of boxes to check that our board became focused on just checking the box and moving on so we could say we hit our goals. And I wanted something that we could really get our entire membership behind that could be used as an external document as well as an internal document as well. But that doesn't mean that you don't need those timelines as well for your execution side. So for us, we have our external plan, which you'll see in the next slides when we get to that. But we also have an internal working document that we developed that has those timelines and those deliverables so that we can make sure we're on track. And for us in the execution space, we integrate that into every one of our monthly all-staff meetings. So we look at what are the items coming up for the next several quarters and what would we like to do on those? What are the next steps? Who is championing those so that the plan becomes really owned by the entire team and the different departments become responsible for their own items, but with input from the entire team as well. We also integrate them into the board reports. So this is very important to us. Many chambers and organizations have one person who, quote, owns the plan, whether it's perhaps the governance chair or the chair or chair-elect of the board of directors, or even the president and CEO. And while it's important to have someone steward things through, it's also important that this doesn't become just the pet project of one person or individual. So for us, what's been really successful over the years is really getting our entire board on board with the plan. So our structure with our executive committee includes vice chairs. So we have a vice chair for membership, a vice chair for business advocacy, vice chair for communications, for example. So within their monthly reports out to the board, they note on the progress in the different elements in the strategic plan. So if there's something about incorporating video and earned media, the vice chair for communications will note in his report or her report that when they are presenting that out, that those are elements that are fulfilling the strategic plan. We also had a wonderful staff retreat where we really worked through some of the bigger picture items that don't have a definite time frame and looking at next steps and work plans behind those as well. Next slide. So here you'll see an example of what our plan looks like. Again, it's a document that we're able to share externally and really get our entire membership base as well as our community excited about. Next slide. You'll see on the inside that it's a good balance of having the content and then also having those important metrics at the bottom as well. So it has both the qualitative and quantitative, which we have found have worked really well on our end. But again, every community is completely different. So it's about figuring out where your organization is as well as your broader community and what's the best fit for you. So with that, I will turn things over to David.
Thanks, Kate. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to take a little different approach. The Greater Omaha Chamber has been doing kind of the standard operational strategic, 5-year strategic planning process for a long time. In our community, the Chamber plays a pretty significant role in engaging in a lot of the big community issues that happen here. We're also the regional economic development entity, so we have responsibility for growing the economy as well as building the infrastructure, if you will, both the policy and physical infrastructure around the economic development effort to make them both successful. But in our vision statement and our mission statement, we are a catalytic organization, and our board has the expectation that we are going to cause change to happen that will help improve both the economy and the quality of life in the region that we represent, with Omaha being in the center of that region. I would point you to the ACCE Horizons Initiative to look at the particular chapter that talks about catalytic leadership and the role that chambers can play in moving their communities forward. And that's going to be sort of the framework within which we talked about here. So first, I would agree with both what Sheree and Kate mentioned are fundamentally important things that go along with strategic planning. You've got to be able to do the assessments before you even start, so you know what the base of information is that you're using, what your current status is, and where you want to cause change to happen, whether it's programmatically or in communities. That's a necessary first step in any strategic planning process that you run through. And similarly, tying all of these to your mission and vision, that you're looking at your values, at your donor priorities, at your member priorities, what your community priorities are, what revenue trends are. And in our particular case, we worry a lot about donor fatigue because of the amount of support that we've continued to get over the last several decades. So we've gone through those traditional strategic planning efforts with and without consultants since really the early 90s. Those strategic plans have mostly focused on what the economic development efforts could accomplish, and then what level of support do they need from legislative initiatives, and then how do we help our members engage in growing their businesses through our services at a chamber. So we've got this interesting bifurcation of who we are. We are a chamber that also happens to be an economic development organization. And so everything we try and do rolls into both of those key missions of ours. So the good news is, since the early 90s, as we've done this 5-year strategic planning process, we've continued to hit our economic development and public policy goals. We've raised a boatload of money over the years, typically in a 5-year strategic planning environment. So we build a plan, accomplish those goals, build another plan, raise the money, hit those goals again. And we've been really doing that since the early 90s. And we've raised nearly $100 million since the early 90s to just fund the economic development and other development efforts of the Chamber. And we've had broad financial and volunteer support to make those happen. But in the mid 2015-16 timeframe, we started looking at what our next 5-year strategic plan was going to look like, and realized that there were some nagging issues that just weren't being addressed. That even though the economy continued to grow, even during the last recession, even though unemployment remained very, very low, even though we were hitting all of our economic development goals and were arguably being very, very successful in the legislature and the infrastructure space, even in the community growth space, there were still some nagging things that just weren't being addressed. And it made sense for us to try and figure out, so what are we not doing that could move the community in the direction of everybody having an opportunity to grow in the prosperity space? So frankly, that a rising tide really did lift all boats, not just a selection of those boats. So we began a process then to try and figure out what alternatives do we have in the strategic planning space. And we've been fortunate that we started working with Rebecca Ryan and Next Generation Consulting, which is a group that helped us with our Young Professionals Council in the very early 2000s. And you can go to the next slide if you like, Susan. And we tried to figure out, is there another way for us to look at doing strategic planning? And Rebecca, who is a futurist, said, there is another way. You can look as a community at what you want to become 15, 20, 30 years down the road, and then use that as a directional map, and then backcast from that, if you will, do some backward planning to figure out what steps you need to take today to start moving you towards those overall goals. We call it a strategic foresight process. There are lots of different titles that you can use for this, but basically it answers the question that's on the screen. If Greater Omaha could emerge as one of America's next great regions, what if we could be intentional about making that happen? What if we could actually get a large portion of our community thinking about what we wanted this community to be able to say about itself 20 years from now? And what if we could actually then start developing strategic plans that look forward rather than backward? Now, I understand all this research we still have to do to get to this statement, but still we're trying to think about how can we be forward thinking rather than backward thinking. So we did engage a futurist. We actually hired Next Generation Consultants as our in-house futurist for the year. We asked co-sponsors of the United Way of the Midlands and the Urban League of Nebraska to co-sponsor this event with us, because we realized that this planning process was not just going to focus on what the economy of the region needed to look like. It needed to look at all the issues that impact the region, and then we could identify the role the Chamber and the business community would be asked to play to help create that vision into a reality. So both United Way and the Urban League agreed. We orchestrated a process. We had about 1,000 participants that were involved in a lot of individual meetings, public meetings, large group meetings, small group meetings, that basically led to a process where we could identify what the sort of official future looked like, which is, I think, futurist terminology for if you continue doing what you're doing, this is what Greater Omaha, in our case, would look like in 2040. And then we identified several preferred futures that basically say, if you cause these disruptions to happen, this is what your future could look like. Or if certain disruptions happen that you don't have no control over, this is what could also happen to your community. And so we not only started out with that base of data that we talked about earlier, but also then started looking at those trends that we are looking at into the future that are impacting communities, are impacting chambers, and in particular would impact our region. So I would refer to you again to the Horizons initiatives to see what those other influences are. Those were some of the things that we took into consideration. But in this case, we also looked at some key changes that were going to be taking place in our market. We weren't growing fast enough from a population perspective, which means we weren't growing fast enough from the availability of talent perspective. We were having huge changes demographically, and so we had to figure out what we were going to do to impact in a positive way the business community and the community at large to embrace all of those changes. And frankly, we wanted Greater Omaha to be an even better place than it would have been had we just continued doing the work that we were doing. Now, you're going to see that this, you can go to the next slide if you don't mind, Susan. What we ended up looking at here was a preferred future for Greater Omaha. And this is going to look, at this stage, very different than your normal strategic planning. And I was a little uncomfortable with this at the beginning, to tell you the truth, because it is a narrative description of what a place could be. What you have on the screen, the preferred future, is a snapshot of a statement that says, here's what Greater Omaha would like to be able to say about itself in 2040. And you can see it has a lot of moving parts. We're a great next generation region, cultural diversity, public, private, and civic sector, being committed to innovation, entrepreneurship, and excellence. We're growing a high growth, high tech economy, an importer of talent with a whole bunch of best places accolades. So that's a general statement. That is, if you go to our website, greateromahachamber.org, or you can even type in Omaha 2040, and it'll take you to the complete document of what the preferred future and then what the individual parts of that future look like. If you go to the next slide, I think you'll see this in our 2040 plan that was broken into three major categories: people, place, and business growth. Actually, in the plan, you'll see that it says prosperity in the Omaha 2040 plan. What you're seeing are some statements that we then translated into what we call our Prosper Omaha 2.0 strategy, which is where we start getting into some very specific measurables about the role that we're going to play. In the beginning, though, you've got to get your head wrapped around the fact that we're telling stories. And as Sheree said earlier, storytelling is becoming a very important part of any chamber exec's toolbox of being able to define and describe what the outlook will look like, what the impact will look like of any program that we're engaging in. And so our people, place, and prosperity statements, again, are backed up by a significant amount of additional narrative data that identify what we need to do in order to create this place that focuses on people, place, and prosperity, and how those individual segments impact each other. And then we took all of these and developed them into our Prosper Omaha 2.0 strategic plan, which looks and feels much more like the plan that Kate presented to you. It has a very specific set of goals and objectives. You can also find that on our website, omahachamber.org. Go to Prosper Omaha 2.0, and you can see all of the very, very specific measurables that we apply that says if we accomplish these things over the next 5 years, these are the steps that we're going to take in order to make a very different impact on our community. So I'll conclude with just a quick statement of what our expectations are. So we know that we are now involved in some things that the Chamber would never have been involved in before as a result of this strategic planning initiative. We now have a talent initiative where I have 5 people dedicated full-time to worrying about growing the population and attracting and retaining and developing talent. One of those particular pieces is a diversity and inclusion director who's working at helping our companies become better, diverse employers and creating more inclusive cultures at their companies, and us creating an even more inclusive culture within our community. We have a transportation director now that is focused on creating a regional transit strategy, so we upgrade the amount of transportation choices that our folks have here. And our economic development strategy has changed dramatically in that we're focusing much more on entrepreneurship and growing our own companies rather than just the traditional recruitment of new business and retention expansion of existing business and small business growth. So I think that this process for us has moved us not only into an area where we are trying to cause change in the community, but in many cases have put us at the pointy end of the spear in making substantive changes not only in how our businesses operate, but what the community will look like in the future. And I'll be happy to kind of talk to any of you that want to talk about how we impact people, place, or prosperity in any of that agenda. So with that, Susan, why don't I turn it back over to you and you can do the questions and answer period.
Well, thank you both. I think you can see why I wanted both Kate and David to share their experience because they've done such a great job of figuring out what their community needs were and putting together a plan that really worked for them. I'm going to let Susan remind everyone how you can submit questions.
Okay, well, thanks, Sheree Ann and David and Kate. Now is the time to ask questions if you have any, and we encourage those. Take a look at your webinar panel, open up the question box, and just type in your question, send it out, and we will see it here at ACCE and read the question to our panel. So please don't hesitate to ask your questions.
And while you're typing your questions in, and again, we love questions, I'm going to ask Susan to actually move to the next slide. ACCE does have a host of resources that can help you with your strategic planning work. As you had heard, the Horizon Initiative was actually used as the backdrop for all three of these strategic plans. So there's a lot of information available on our website about the Horizon Initiative, and you can leverage that for some of your strategic planning work as well. We've got sample plans in our online library. That's a great place to go and see what other chambers have done. You can sort of cherry pick ideas that might be a match for your community. We've obviously got a great set of data. We can also create custom benchmarking studies for you. That's all available through our dynamic chamber benchmarking platform, and that's online. I highly recommend you checking that out. And then ACCE staff is also available to help facilitate your staff or board planning retreats. We can also help you craft your plan. It's part of our customized consulting offering. So if you're interested in trying to get someone from our team to help you out, we can do that as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Susan to read the questions.
Okay, we have a couple questions so far. Let me scroll up here. Okay, this is for David. David, you mentioned donor fatigue. How did you assess that or address that?
That's a great question. So when you do a series of 5-year campaigns like we have since the early 90s, you end up with a core of givers who have been in all of those campaigns. And so going back to them every 4 or 5 years and saying, hey, will you give again? And by the way, will you give at a higher level? Can be fraught with a challenge if those same organizations are also the go-to organizations for lots of other community giving. And so we took a very front-loaded approach and sat down with each of our individual investors and asked them, number one, do they still have a desire to invest in the kinds of things that they have invested in the past? And or are there things that they believe that we should be doing that they would be more interested in investing in? Or are there things that we're currently doing that they really have no interest in investing in? And then we pulled that group of investors together for a series of focus groups so that we had the ability to hear from the collective group as well as from individuals. And interestingly, we kept them all informed on a regular basis about what we were doing, what we were getting done. We had meetings with them quarterly so they knew that there was an opportunity to ask questions and be part of what we were doing. So they were relatively well informed. But these one-on-one meetings really got into the nitty-gritty about what we were getting done and whether or not their dollars were being invested in a productive way. So I recommend this donor fatigue question needs to be addressed often, not just once every 5 years, that you have regular meetings with your investors so that you make sure that they're hearing what you're doing and you're hearing what they need you to do. But then before you embark upon any campaign, you go back to your investors again and make sure that they have an interest in continuing to invest in you and what those priorities need to be. This last one that we did, clearly our members told us, our investors told us, we need to be doing more than we've been doing, or maybe even better, need to be doing something differently than we've been doing to make sure we're impacting these big issues in the community. And we listened to them. And as a result, they came back and they have funded us at a greater level than they've ever funded us before.
Okay, well, thank you, David. This next question is for Kate. This person's curious as to how much external feedback you sought for your plan. And by external, you're referring to, he refers to non-members, drop members, and community stakeholders.
It's a great question. So for this plan, we didn't do as extensive of the external feedback. For our last plan iteration, we had done that because we had done that so relatively recently. For this iteration of the plan, we really focused on the broader board as well as staff feedback. But we have before done some outreach in that space, and you'll actually see some elements of the plan, of this version of our plan, that include some external work and some reaching out, doing, targeted for us, really figuring out how to target that C-suite segment and reaching out to, with not just a survey, as Sheree mentioned in terms of the ACCE survey. Survey links can often be ignored, but really that qualitative feedback of reaching out for, coffee meetings and getting that sort of feedback. So there are elements of that woven in this plan as well.
Okay. The next question is for all of you. She is wondering how you all have approached the double-sided nature of your work in strategic planning, then the internal and the external community work. They want their policy, economic, community development work to have a strategic plan informed by the community, but obviously have internal operation strategies that need to be included as well.
I'll kick off really quickly, and then I'll turn it back over to our panelists. This is a good question. How do you blend the internal and the external? And I think it's really important when you're piecing together your strategic plan that you do give consideration to both of those components. So in ACCE's plan, as I mentioned, that last fourth pillar is really about internal excellence. And that makes sure that we're not only focused on what the community's needs are and how we can be of best service to them, but we're also looking internally at how to be more efficient, more effective, breaking down silos, making sure our structure is reflective of what we're trying to accomplish. So even when you're going through the planning process, whether it's a staff retreat or a board retreat, making sure that you're analyzing what works and what doesn't, both on the inside and the outside, and making sure your plan aligns with the resources that you do have, because it's easy to get a fantastic pie-in-the-sky plan, but if you don't have the team or the funding or other resources to back it up, it can be problematic. So that's how we approached it, but I'd love to hear how either Kate or David have dealt with that internal and external conundrum.
Sure. So we actually, out of our three focus areas, our third was operations. So we have those elements woven directly into the plan as well. And one aspect of the operations section, which I think is great, is adopting a continuous improvement model. And that really opens up the door to constant evaluation as well as those internal processes as well. And for us, it really gets into that execution. We're having everyone own the plan and realizing that, again, reporting out, whether it's the board or the staff, but everybody being a piece of this and making sure that things are moving forward in that sense.
Kate, we basically did the same thing. If you look at the Prosper 2040 and Prosper 2.0 work, what you'll see is three components: people, place, and prosperity or business growth. And then for our overall chamber agenda and our work program we put together every year, we've added a fourth component, basically called operations, where we have to pay attention to how we align the dollars that we have, the policies that we have, the people that we have, and the volunteers that we have with those goals. And so we've created several internal agencies, if you will, that provide services across all of our agenda. So our membership area, our membership services area, our marketing and communications area, our public policy area, those all fall within this operations piece, including technology and research. You have to have this kind of bifurcated approach to it, where you want to accomplish great things, but you got to make sure you're managing your resources and people as effectively as you can. So you've got to be just as stringent about planning the operational side of the house with your priorities as you do the external side of the house and developing those priorities.
Okay, great. Thank you. Next question. Can you describe the search for a person to head the entrepreneurial business development piece in Omaha?
Sure. I would suggest that they sort of, I'll say they came to us, but they kind of rose to the top. So we have had a foot in the entrepreneurship space probably for 9 years now. Our first was, frankly, to throw very curious and outgoing legal law student intern into the fray and say, tell us what the ecosystem looks like out there, and is there a place where chambers can be relevant in the entrepreneurship space? And he came back with this very detailed assessment of what our ecosystem looked like, and then we asked him to compare that against other successful communities that we saw as being more successful in the entrepreneurship space than we were, and then tell us where that ecosystem looks like and where our gaps were. We then started building our programming around the places that we thought the chamber could provide some strong support and some unique contacts in the mix. And then over time, as we've continued to get more and more involved, we started trying to figure out where we could be helpful. So we started partnering in the incubator spaces in town. We started partnering in the accelerator spaces in town. And we started working with our corporate community to see if there were internal entrepreneurial needs that they might have, or even so-called entrepreneurial needs they might have. And we kind of evolved into a program where we basically went out and bought an incubator and bought an accelerator and had staff that were already involved with those two areas, plus our own lead person on entrepreneurship. And we created a partnership with those folks, and we've been really fortunate that they've stayed with us over the last few years as we've tried to rebuild the level of intensity of our entrepreneurship program, particularly in the tech space. So we now have very specific goals for how many tech companies we want to try and foster. We've got a very specific acceleration process that's been customized for our market. And we have an incubator in our building that we are the landlords for, that now have 15 startups engaged in the process. So that's a long-winded way to say, in some ways, we bought the talent that we needed. We went out and found the talent that were running the incubators and the accelerators. And we've been really fortunate that people have stepped up whenever we've had to have it and say, I want to be part of that process. And I'm an entrepreneur already, and so let me know how I can be helpful. So we've sort of done it through M&A, but we've also been really fortunate that the existing entrepreneurship leaders in the community have joined with us and have been willing to step up and lead when we needed them to.
Okay, thank you, David. Our last two questions are related, and they have to do with how to get rid of events or stop doing events. The first one, this chamber has not one, but two golf tournaments. The participant has recommended that we discontinue one. It's the lower-ended tourney as opposed to the higher-ended one. Her CEO rejected that recommendation despite metrics that suggest that it be continued. So any suggestions to help make the case for just one golf tournament? And then the other questioner wants an example of an event that was discontinued and how that was done. Sheree, you want to try that?
Sure. And I think these are really important questions to get back at that piece of how do you stop doing things that no longer serve you. So the Horizon initiative that we had mentioned has 9 major influences that are shaping the future of chambers. One of those 9 that I think is one of the most important is resource alignment to mission, which I mentioned. You want to make sure all of the activities you're engaged in are really aligned to that higher purpose mission of your chamber. So our 2 golf tournaments really feeding into that higher purpose mission. One of the ways that you can do this, if you're not currently conducting sort of cost accounting, factoring in all of the staff time and labor hours that would go into the preparation, the setup, day of the event, post-event follow-up, and weave that into the overall finances of the activity or the event can sometimes really show how much time and energy goes into something, and it may not reflect well on how much you're raising for that event, or it might just show that you're spending so much energy on an activity that really is not aligned to your mission. Those would be recommendations from my end. I don't know if Kate or David have other examples of eliminating an event and how you did so.
Sure, I'm happy to jump in on this since it was similar to my example on there. So I think Sheree-Ann's point about factoring in the cost of staff time is an important one. And really, again, that objective lens of those different aspects of the event that I threw on the slide, I think would be key to having that conversation as well in terms of transforming it moving forward. But you do have to have, again, objective buy-in in terms of, that this might be a favored event by some, but what is the actual impact that you're seeing as a result? In addition, we did cut our normal golf tournament as one example of that I gave. Another example of changes that we did. So we had, like many chambers, a Valor Award ceremony. And, while this was a great event, actually being Arlington, years and years ago, obviously when we had 9/11 here, that was a huge, fundamental, important element for our community and our business community in general. Our business community obviously values the public safety community and appreciates everything that they do for us. But this was an event that was declining in attendance year after year. It's an expensive event to put on. You're extending a lot of complimentary registrations, whether they're for the award winners and their families or every elected official and department head that wants to attend the event as well. And, sadly, when there weren't tragedies going on, it made for a relatively boring event. So we looked at, what can we do a little bit differently, but not alienating this segment of our community as well. So we actually combined that together with another event we had that was growing, our State of the County Award, or our State of the County Breakfast event. So we merged those two events together. So it didn't completely eliminate that Valor element, but we call it the State of the County and Public Safety Awards because we realized that the Valor Awards, if there wasn't a tragedy, there many times wouldn't be an actual Valor Award that was awarded. So it was more of a molding one event in with another, but it let us keep our vital public safety departments engaged with the chamber and know that they were still valued, but doing it in a way that was more cost as well as impact intensive.
Great,
I'll be real brief.
Go ahead, David.
If I can be real brief here, we had to get rid of our largest fundraiser, which was at the time a regional trade show, the only one in the region. When I first got here, it was a $250,000 a year net gain for us. And by the time we got around to about 7 or 8 years ago, it had dropped down to about $110,000 a year net gain. That sounds like a lot of money still, but we could just see the writing on the wall. So really briefly, I would suggest that trends can make the argument for you. You need to be able to project out what is currently the status and what you think the likely trends look like. And if that doesn't make the case for you, whether it's on 2 golf tournaments or a major event like ours, then you've got to figure out a way to ultimately build that event into something different so that it can generate the revenue you need.
Perfect. Thank you, David. We actually had a recommendation from someone on the call that if, particularly for the situation around 2 golf tournaments, to probably let your boss know how you'd replace the revenue, because if there's a concern about lost revenue, to showcase what would fill in that gap. And particularly if you allow for labor to be positioned into a different area, how can you make up the revenue in other places? So I know we had one other question we couldn't get to, and we will respond to you offline with some ideas. But I wanted to take this opportunity to just say a huge thanks to Kate and David for sharing their story. We've got contact information up on the slides if you'd like to have any follow-up, but this is a really important activity, and we're glad we had so many folks interested in the topic and on the webinar today. So thank you all for your time. And Susan, I don't know if you have any final closing words.
I just want to echo my thanks to the panelists, Kate, David, Sheree Ann, and also to all participants for your great questions and your interest. A reminder that the webinar was recorded. It'll be posted no later than Monday the 18th along with the presentation slides. And please feel free to contact us here at ACCE, Sheree Ann, or any of us on the ACC team if you have further questions about strategic planning or any other chamber issues that we can help you with. Our next ACC University webinar will be on Thursday, December 5th, and we're going to talk about innovative ways that your chamber peers have used their chamber space. They have transformed their chamber offices to meet the needs of their members, provide new opportunities for convening and collaboration among members of the community, and increase organizational revenue. So we will have the Bonita Springs Area Chamber and the Grand Rapids Area Chamber team present on that webinar. So we look forward to your participation in that webinar and others. Again, thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon, and we will see you on our next ACCE webinar.
Have a great day.
Bye-bye.